President Trump thanking the reporters there in the White House briefing room on his way out the door after about an hour and 45 minutes in there. You heard a lot of it right here on NBC News. He's been taking questions for maybe the last 20, 30 minutes or so, marking the first year of his second term in office here. The president running through what he sees as a list of accomplishments in year one, and also in taking some questions, making some news as well on a couple of topics, from Venezuela, of course, to Greenland. As you heard there, the president not ruling out, not putting anything on or off the table for what he would do when it comes to trying to take or get or perhaps buy that Danish territory. The president also facing a number of questions on the economy as well, given, of course, the tariffs put in place over the course of his first year and the way that many Americans say they feel about the economy. New polling suggests that a majority of voters do not feel like President Trump has done enough to get their everyday prices down, as was one of his campaign pledges on the campaign trail. And you heard the president talk about that, touting the stock market, which has hit record highs during his first year in office, too. In the room for all of it, every minute of it, was our NBC News senior White House correspondent, Garrett Haake. He is joining us now. And Garrett, there's a lot. There's a lot on this front, from foreign policy to the economic, and the president going back and forth there with reporters in the room.
Yeah, that's right. I think the overall piece of this, Hallie, is the president boasting about a first year so good, even the Lord above would be proud, he said, of his achievements so far. Talking mostly in the question and answer portion about foreign policy, seeming, if I read it correctly, to turn down the temperature a little bit after comments over the last several days suggesting that a rift could be coming with NATO, with European allies over Greenland. He's going to have a series of meetings while he's in Davos, Switzerland, when he leaves tonight, and that people will ultimately be happy with the results, being a little bit hard to pin down on NATO, but mostly speaking positively about the alliance and about, in his view, his own effect on it. On domestic priorities, it is befitting a president who ran almost with a heavy focus on immigration. We saw a heavy focus on immigration today, including the president flipping through headshots of people whom he says his administration has arrested in Minnesota alone, and talking about the importance of reversing previous administration's border policies, getting control of the border, talking about his belief in fraud and criminality of illegal immigrants across the country as being one of his biggest achievements. On questions specifically about affordability and the economy, there you saw a little bit of slippage, I think, perhaps from the president, where he was asked very pointedly whether his approach of basically telling Americans the economy is good when they don't feel it is any different from President Biden's. His argument here is that his administration is making progress where the Biden administration didn't. He loves to point to gas prices as kind of a singular economic indicator, and to the stock market, which is up, of course, over the course of the last year, but happens to be down today, with a lot of concern about the tariff threats going back and forth across the Atlantic.
That's right, and natural gas today ticking up, too. Garrett Haake with that lengthy marathon news conference from President Trump there. As you're right, Garrett, he's heading to Davos. More to come on that front in the hours and in the days ahead. Thank you, pal.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.